Okay, so now we're going to introduce classes to you. So classes are another way of kind of storing data. So what they do is they create a new instance of an object. So we call them instances in Swift 3. In other languages they're often called objects, and they kind of form the building blocks of our code. So they just kind of allow us to create these new instances that have predefined they have properties and behavior, and then we can change them and kind of allow us to add in these properties and add these functionalities to these specific instances. Okay, so we've seen enumerations before, and enumerations are just kind of ways to group together groups of similar values. So we can assign an object, well, not exactly an object, but a type that could have a few possible values. That's what enumerations are good for. Now let's talk about classes. So classes are ways to kind of start a new instance of something. So in other languages, classes are kind of, they create new objects. Well, you can think of it as being kind of a similar thing in Swift, except instead of objects, we're going to call them instances. So these allow us to create these instances with a bunch of properties and predefined functions and stuff that kind of just allow us to, that they kind of form what we call the building blocks of our code. So let's look at an example now, and the example that we're going to use is going to be a bag. So we're going to call this class, and we're just going to call this bag. Okay, so this is starting a new class. We have to call it a class, and it starts with a capital letter. So bag is a pretty broad term. So the way the class is set up is we have our fields or global variables, and they're global in the scope of the class, meaning that they're outside of all of the functions and right at the front of the class, but a true global variable would actually be outside of the class and would probably be up here. For example, string is a true global variable, whereas anything in the class is global only in the scope of this class. That's why they're often called fields. So we have fields or global variables at the top. Sometimes we have a constructor. In this case we're not going to. And then we have the methods associated, or rather the functions associated with the class right underneath all of the fields. So what kind of fields would a bag have? What kind of properties would it have? Well, a bag might have a color. So let's create this one called color, and let's just set it to type string. And it's going to be an optional string because we don't want to give it a value just yet. Bag can also have, in fact, and before color I'm going to put a name. So perhaps we named our bag. I don't know, if you want to name your bag you can go ahead and do that. I have not personally, but that's fine. So it'll have name, a color, and it will have a list of objects, and that's going to be of type string array. And I'm just going to initialize this to be an empty array for now. Okay, so what other properties could a bag have other than a name, a color, and list of objects inside? We could give it a type if we want, but I think you get the picture. So these are just properties that the bag could have, and they're all variables. We've given them a type. We could assign them to contain values right now, but for now we haven't given the bag a name, we haven't given the bag a color, and we've just said that it's an empty, it contains a list of empty objects. Okay, so let's create some functions that we might have with a bag. Well, we might have something like add to bag. So let's create this function add to bag, and it's going to take in an item, and that's going to be a string. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to say list of objects dot append item. And what this function is basically going to do is it's just going to, once it's called, we have to give it a parameter which is going to be a string item, and it's just going to add that item to the list of objects. And then we might have another function called get item or get items. So this will maybe tell us what's in the bag, We don't need any parameters. This one is just going to be, I guess this should have a return type. And this is going to be a string array. And it's just going to return the list of objects. Okay, so before we create a new instance of this class, let's go ahead and just review what's going on here. So we've created this class called bag, and a bag can have a name, it can have a color, and it can have a list of objects that it contains. We then created two, and we just initialized the list to be empty and the name and color to be nil right now. So the function add to the bag will take in an item, and it will just add this item to our list of objects. The function get items is just going to return the list of objects and tell us everything that's in our bag. So now with classes, this is just creating the class, much like creating a variable, but we haven't actually started a new instance of the class. Or rather, this is kind of like creating a type. Okay, so each time you define a class, you're creating essentially a brand new type. So just like when we declare variables, so for example we have variable string and then it's of type, well, we already have a string, let's just say string 2, and it's of type string. If we create a new variable called backpack, maybe this is of type bag, so this will be type bag. Okay, so we're creating this new variable called backpack, and we're assigning it to be a new bag. So rather than assigning it to be a string or an integer or anything like that, we're assigning it to be a new bag. So this is going to create a new instance of this class bag. So right now bag has no name, its name is nil, the color is nil, and the list of objects that it contains is empty. It has these two functions, however, so what we could do is we could right away initialize it to contain a list of objects, initialize it to contain a name and a color, and we can even call these objects on it. So the way we do that is we call backpack dot, and then it gives us this list of different things we can do. So we can call the function add to the bag, we can call the function get items, and notice this m and the m here, that's because these are methods. These are things that do stuff, so like we can actually add it to the bag that's doing something, we can get the items that's doing something. Whereas the V's here, the green V, these are just kind of properties, these are fields. So if we say backpack.color equals red, then that just assigns our backpack color to be red. And if we say backpack.name equal to something like my backpack, and we can set our list of objects, backpack.list of objects, to contain some kind of objects. Let's just say our bag contains a laptop, our bag contains a notebook, and our bag contains a pen. Okay, so now we've initialized a new instance of a bag, we've called it backpack. So we've essentially created a new object, we've created a new instance of a bag. Now we've assigned some of the properties, so we're saying our bag, which is called backpack, the color is red, the name is my backpack, and the list of objects right now contains a laptop, notebook, and a pen. Now, so if we do this, if we do backpack.get items, then let's see what prints out. So we get our list of items, which is going to be laptop, notebook, and pen. What if we do backpack.add to bag, and let's add in something such as, what could we add to a bag? Let's add in a lunch, because everyone needs a lunch at some point. So now this has added the item lunch to backpack, and notice how it doesn't show up on the get items line here. And the reason being is that we retrieved the items before we added this item to a bag. However, if we now call backpack.getItems, we should have lunch added to our backpack, and indeed we do. So it now contains laptop, notebook, pen, and a lunch as well. Okay, so this is a basic intro into what classes are. Classes just kind of allow us to create an instance and define its properties and behavior. So the great thing is that if there are objects or variables that exist that we're not quite happy with, we can just create an entirely new class, give it these properties and behavior, and then use that. Okay, so classes really form the basis of your code. You'll put pretty much everything in a class in Swift 3 to make it kind of object oriented. And then this just allows you, again, to create these objects or instances and define properties. We can add in functions. So one thing to note is you'll see a lot of these kind of get functions. Get functions and set functions you'll use all the time. So get functions generally just return something, whereas set functions kind of set a value. So we could have this function, we could have this function set name, for example. And that's going to take in a name that's a string. And all this is going to do is it's going to say name equals, well actually I should say, call this something like a name. And then we could say name equals a name. Okay, and this would just set the bag's name to whatever we put in here. So if we said something like, and then what we could do is we could have a setter and a guesser for that, and then a get name, and then that just returns a string, and that returns name. So if we want to see this in action, we could do backpack dot set name to be, cool backpack or something. And then we get the name, so backpack dot get name, and then we should have cool backpack returned to us. I see, what's the error here? String not unwrapped, there we go. So we need to unwrap it, and then it should be a-okay. So we get the name cool backpack. Alright, so gets and setters. Setters are particularly useful if you need to set a property. So any field you add, any of these properties, you might want to consider adding in a setter if it's something that's going to be changing a lot. So if it's just going to be, in this case, if it's like a name or something, then we might just want to define the name once we create it. But if it's going to be something, some kind of a property that we're changing over and over again, then we might want to add this function, the setter for it, and a getter as well that will retrieve it. So getters just retrieve the current value of the item, whereas setters set the current value. Okay, so those two functions are very important. You'll probably see a lot of those in your classes. And yeah, otherwise this is what a class is. It just creates an instance or an object that allows us to define properties and implement these functions that allow us to kind of retrieve and store data within an object.